Well, we talked about the French Reformed Church broadly speaking in the first hour. Now I'd like to speak specifically about one man in the French Reformed Church, Pierre Dumoulin. So if you heard of the movie or watched it, Moulin Rouge, that came out a few years ago, so that's Moulin. It means mill. So in English, he would be Peter Mill. So Pierre Dumoulin. He was a pastor in the early 17th century, and he was kind of the celebrity pastor of the French Reformed Church, to put it in today's language. He was the most well-known French Reformed pastor of that period, and became their leading polemicist, as we'll see. But in the fall of 1620, he nearly lost his freedom. The ambassador of King James the Sixth and First of Scotland and England pleaded with Dumoulin to write to King James, trying to convince him that he would aid his son-in-law, who was in the kingdom of Bohemia in the early days of the 30 Years' War. 30 Years' War broke out in 1618. It was the most bloody war in European history up to that point. Devastating war. And King James was the most powerful Protestant monarch in Europe at that time, and inexplicably, maybe, he sat out the 30 Years' War, even though his son-in-law was at the heart of it. So King James' ambassador tries to convince Pierre Dumoulin, who knew King James, to try to convince him to enter into the war. But Dumoulin had been very careful prior to this moment in 1620 not to entangle himself in political matters, because, with the French king being Roman Catholic, he had to walk very delicately not to find himself in the crosshairs of the French king. So he refused initially the ambassador's request because he said, this business was too high for a man of low condition like me. But then the ambassador said that Dumoulin's letters were always very acceptable to His Majesty and might work very much upon him. So the ambassador's pleading with him to lobby King James to enter this war. So Dumoulin finally complies with this request. He delivers the letter to the ambassador's secretary, and then Dumoulin traveled to the Reformed Synod. But the letter never reached King James. A very foolish move on the part of Dumoulin. So the French king intercepts the letter. They order his arrest for petitioning a foreign monarch to engage in war on behalf of Protestants. Dumoulin receives word that he's a wanted man. So he sneaks into Paris. He meets with the ambassador, who tells him, you better make a break for it. He doesn't return home. He leaves Paris. He leaves the church he had pastored for 20 years. And he escaped to Sedan, which is a city of refuge, which is now part of France, but at that time it was outside of the Kingdom of France in the northeast region, and that's where he remained for the majority of the rest of his life. His ambition and confidence had garnered him international influence and financial gain, but these passions clouded his judgment in sending the letter to James, and it led him to the lowest moment of his life. He lost his congregation. He lost the primary means of providing for his family, and he could no longer participate in the ecclesiastical activity of the French Reformed churches, the synods and church meetings. And it nearly cost him his life. But that doesn't end his story with King James. 2 years later, the king dialogues with him again, and he returns to England, Dumoulin does, and he remained in England until shortly after James died in 1625. And he, on behalf of King James, he wrote a response to Cardinal du Perron, who was one of the leading Roman Catholic apologists of the day. So on behalf of King James, Dumoulin writes against him in 1627. And he said, the great king, having given me the honor to employ my pen for his defense during his lifetime, I would be ungrateful to his memory if I abandoned his cause after his death. So this is Pierre Dumoulin writing for King James. And Dumoulin, this is one example of the many polemical works that Dumoulin produced in that period. He was the preeminent figure in the French Reformed churches in that day. His treatises, his devotional works, and his sermons appeared in more than 1,200 separate editions or printings. And one historian estimated that Dumoulin published more frequently than any Calvinist writer during the 16th and 17th centuries, with the only possible exceptions being John Calvin and Theodore Beza. So behind Calvin and Beza, Dumoulin probably produced the most theological writings of any Reformed Protestant in that period. So we'll look in this address on his life as the polemicist of the French Reformed Church. He's born in 1568. His father was a pastor. His father was born into a Roman Catholic family, but is converted. And he praised his father for his honorable conversation, his brave mind, and his continual afflictions for the gospel, which he bore cheerfully, his fervent zeal, his vigilance in his calling, his pleasing and affable behavior, which seasoned with a meek gravity. These, I say, were as far from the air of the cloister as the heaven is from the earth, and the mass from the gospel. So he's saying his father is a very honorable man, very different from the monks and from the mass. So his father was a pastor, and he was forced to flee often due to persecution. He was a primary target of the Roman Catholic civil magistrate, and in the autumn of 1568, he had to flee during the religious wars. He left Normandy and settled in Soissons, where he pastored the Reformed congregation. And then in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, Pierre's maternal grandfather was martyred, and he said this left to his posterity the honor to be the seed of a martyr, which is no small nobility. And Pierre's father, Joachim, the pastor, he was a target, as I said, for the Roman Catholic soldiers. So he and his wife left their 4 children in the care of a Roman Catholic farm woman, and they fled in the other direction. They left the children there to kind of throw the Catholic soldiers off the scent. And they fled to Sedan, and they're in this Catholic farmhouse, and the soldiers show up at the farmhouse. So the farm woman hid the children, and Pierre and his sister were hiding under a bed, and the Catholic soldiers barge in, and his sister is trying to keep him quiet. He's 4 years old. He's whimpering under the bed, and she nearly smothered him to death, trying to keep him quiet. The soldiers burst into the bedroom where they are, and the Catholic farm woman knocked a pitcher off a shelf and broke it, and that distracted the soldier, and he left the room, and Pierre and his sister survived. He received his education at the college at Sedan, where his father pastored. And his mother died, Pierre's mother died in 1573 when he's 5 years old. His father remarried the following year. But his father, as a pastor, was, they lived a life of poverty. You can imagine a persecuted pastor in that day struggled financially. And initially, he sent Pierre to Paris to find work, but persecution broke out in Paris, so Pierre had to flee to England, and he entered the universities there and received a strong education, which was rather rare for a Reformed Protestant in that time. Usually only the wealthy had the same education that Pierre Dumoulin did. So we have to understand, I think, his actions, his writings, his behavior over the course of his life in light of St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, 1572. Again, he's 4 years old. And in light of his father's living under persecution and extreme poverty. And his enduring enthusiasm for anti-Catholic polemics and his relentless attacks in each of his works, I think much of that can be attributed to that experience he had as 4 years old undergoing St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. And during his time in England, he received news that his younger brother in France had been captured by Roman Catholics and buried alive. So you can imagine he didn't have warm feelings toward Roman Catholics, and especially the hierarchy. So I think that that enlivened his pen to take them on in all of these polemical works. When he moved to London, he connected with the Huguenot. There's already a Huguenot congregation there. He filled the pulpit there on multiple occasions, and he was supported by some of the Reformed churches in France. And early on, the Reformed congregation in Paris inquired if he would be interested in serving in the congregation in Paris, but he declined the offer early on because he was worried they couldn't pay him. Again, his father lived in poverty for so many years as a pastor, so he was concerned, even as a young man, about providing for himself. But then later they did assure him that they could support him. So he actually came there in 1600 to be the pastor. But he found work as a tutor in England, first in Cambridge, and this enabled him to continue his own studies at Cambridge while he was working as a tutor. And then he also spent time in Oxford. And I have some information if you're interested on his influences while in England to theologians John Reynolds and William Whitaker, two Puritan theologians who I think influenced Dumoulin. But he spent 4 years in England, and then he made his way to the University of Leiden, and he taught logic and Greek in the college there, and then he later moved to the university. The college there was kind of like a high school. So you start out in college, and then you end up at the university. So he ends up teaching philosophy at the university. And his son called Leiden his father's fencing school, where he was enabled for the many encounters and conferences which he had afterwards upon the greatest stage of Europe. So this is where he learns how to be a polemicist in Leiden. He published a logic textbook in Leiden, which became kind of a standard textbook in that day, was issued in 13 different editions. And you can see as you read his work, very logical, just like Calvin I mentioned with his arguments. Dumoulin is very logical in his presentation of his arguments. It's not just some haphazard writing. He's got very strict argumentation. He took leave from the university in 1596 to visit his father in France, and he stopped in Paris on his journey back to Leiden, and he met with the pastor and the elders of the Reformed congregation there. They asked him to remain in the city, but again, he couldn't take that position because he ensured the university that he would return to Leiden. And then in 1598, he finally submitted to the Reformed churches to become a minister. He left his post in Leiden. And for the rest of his life, though, he did maintain a great affection for the Dutch people and for Holland. He called it his second country. Now, he had lived through the lowest point in the history of the French Reformed churches, St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. He lived through the extreme poverty in France and as a young man in England. And now he returned to France and arrived there in 1599, which was the most opportune moment for the emerging French Reformed churches and for Dumoulin himself as a pastor and polemicist. So as I mentioned, 1598 was the Edict of Nantes, and that allowed them, the Huguenots, the French Reformed, to hold worship services at the home of Princess Catherine Bourbon. So she's the sister of Henry IV, the king that I mentioned. He was the apostate Protestant turned Roman Catholic. Well, his sister remained Reformed, Catherine, and she hosted worship services at her home. And eventually they built a church in Charenton, again, outside of the city of Paris. And they experienced relative stability there at Charenton during the period of the Edict of Nantes. So he's examined, he's ordained in 1598, and he arrives in Paris on the last day of February 1599. And we can see his acceptance of the pastoral call to Paris his life prior to that was preparing him for this monumental task. Again, he became the most well-known French Reformed pastor theologian of that period. Educated in Sedan and in England, as I said, experienced as a professor in the Netherlands. He was hardened by the persecution he experienced as a child, the financial hardship. So now he is in prime position to be influential in the French Reformed churches. And his reputation grew quickly, such that he was offered multiple times to leave his church. The Reformed Academy at Saumur, France, twice offered him a position as professor, 1604, 1605. The University of Leiden asked him to come back to fill the chair of divinity in 1609 and again in 1619, but on each occasion, the church in Paris refused to grant him permission to leave. They said, "We need you here. We can't let you go elsewhere." It's interesting when you learn of the authority that the elders of the French Reformed churches exercised, the Reformed churches in general, the authority that the elders exercised in the 16th and 17th centuries, that many occasions they did not allow their minister to leave to take another call. And you elders still have that authority today in Reformed churches. You don't have to release your minister to take another call. But in that day, it seemed much more common. We rarely hear of that today, that a session will not release their minister. But it was fairly common in the Reformed churches of the 16th and 17th centuries. So he stayed in Paris, and he actually lived a good life. Again, under the Edict of Nantes, they were relatively free from persecution, so he lived in a home spacious enough to accommodate his 5 children. He also had a study on the top floor of the house. And according to his son, he wrote a biography of his father after his father died. Pierre did face multiple attempts against his life in the home. So again, he was the primary target for the Roman Catholic civil magistrate. And assassins came on multiple occasions. One time, he had a servant/bodyguard who kind of scared a guy away. One time, his wife actually turned a guy away at the door that they perceived had ill intent. One time, poisoned flowers were sent to his home. And twice, his house received musket fire from angry mobs. So this was just par for the course. As a French Reformed pastor, again, as I said, your life was on the line. And this is the period of peace after the Edict of Nantes. But they knew this was part of the call. As a French Reformed pastor, your life could be taken from you. So not only did he escape these multiple attempts on his life, on multiple occasions he nearly did himself in. He did the job that the assassins couldn't do. On one night, he was bitterly cold in his unheated study, so he had basically a charcoal, the equivalent of a space heater, and he wasn't paying attention, and he nearly suffocated himself with the smoke in this little room. His son found him passed out in the study, and he runs downstairs shouting, "My father's dead." So they drag him out and revive him, and he was back in the pulpit in just a few weeks. So his life was very adventurous during this period. Never a dull moment for a pastor of the French Reformed Church in this era. Now, we mentioned King Henry IV. The physical violence of the religious wars cooled a bit under Henry IV, but the theological controversy between Roman Catholics and Protestants picked up. So as the physical confrontations ebbed a bit during this period, that allowed room for the treatise wars to pick up. So really, in the first decade of the 17th century, we see many debates take place, not only in person, but also written debates between Catholics and Protestants. Many different theological issues were addressed, but the primary issues were Scripture, the authority of Scripture, and the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper. Of course, Reformed Protestants argued for sola scriptura, with regard to the authority of Scripture and for the spiritual presence of Christ in the Lord's Supper. Roman Catholics argue for Scripture and tradition as authority, and also for the transubstantiation of the Mass. But the assassination of Henry IV in 1610 ensured that the relationship between theology and politics would receive the bulk of the attention of religious debates during the years ahead. 1610, Henry is assassinated by a radical Roman Catholic, and then this ignites the treatise wars of what is the role of politics and religion, what authority does the Pope have in the temporal realm, what authority does the king have, all this political, theological stuff kind of pops up in this period. And really, I think the golden era was the first decade of the 17th century. Let's talk now about another king. King James. England and Scotland had a very close relationship with Dumoulin. They began their official cooperation in 1609. James published a book titled The Apology for the Oath of Allegiance. So in 1605, November 5th, remember the 5th of November, there's an attempt on the life of not only King James, but both houses of Parliament in the gunpowder plot. Roman Catholic assassins plotted to blow up the houses of Parliament. So after this, James issues the Oath of Allegiance. So basically every English person, everyone living in England, had to swear an oath to the monarch of England, vowing loyalty to the monarch over against any foreign entity, basically the Pope. It's a way to get a Catholic sympathizer to swear loyalty to the king over against loyalty to the Pope. And no honest Roman Catholic could take this oath and deny his loyalty to the Pope. So that was kind of the goal of this, a way to kind of smoke out the Catholics in England. So there's an apology. This is known as the Oath of Allegiance controversy. It goes on for about 20 years after this. So King James sends a copy of this book to Dumoulin. Then in 1609, Dumoulin offers to write on behalf of King James in again, some of these treatise wars back and forth. And they have a mutual respect in this relationship, that James enlists Dumoulin to write on his behalf, which was unusual for James. He typically only requested theologians in the Church of England to take up his cause. So to be outside of the Church of England for Dumoulin, it's an honor that James would entrust him with writing on his behalf. And Dumoulin goes out of his way to assist King James. You know, he didn't really need to do this, to write on behalf of the English monarch, but he does, trying to ingratiate himself to James with this. So they had a mutual affection, mutual respect. And one significant aspect of their relationship was their plan for Christian union. The French Reformed had been pursuing unity amongst Protestants since their 1578 National Synod, and nearly every synod after this, they approve activity related to Protestant ecumenism, including the adoption of other churches' confessions, the proposal of a general synod of Reformed churches, and the call for collaboration on a joint confession. So in this period, in the Reformed churches of Europe, there is great desire for unity, for collaboration, working together, because, especially in France, they're so fragile. They need the support, not only physically, but even the prayer support and just the communication with each other, encouraging one another, that there's beautiful unity amongst the Protestants, French Reformed and the Reformed Protestants in other countries in Europe. Beautiful Protestant unity in this era. So Dumoulin takes up this cause of Protestant ecumenism, Protestant union, and he writes in 1613 a letter to King James, and he includes 20 articles outlining how they would unite Protestantism. So again, we have to think back to this era. There is no separation of church and state. So if they can unite Protestants, theologically, ecclesiastically, politically, then they will be a much more formidable opponent for not only Rome, theologically, ecclesiastically, but also politically. And we're leading up to the 30 Years' War. Again, Catholic Protestants clashing, 1618. So the Protestants are trying to come together theologically and also politically to be a monolithic opponent of all the Catholic magistrates in Europe. So he outlines his plan for union, 1613. His proposal included an initial gathering of 2 theologians from each state. So 2 theologians from France, from the German Reformed territories, from England, Netherlands, etc. And then at this meeting, they would place all the Reformed confessions on a table, and from them they would write a new one. So at this point you have the French Confession, you have the Belgian Confession, you have the Heidelberg Catechism. Each territory had its own confessional documents. So the idea, they all come together, and then we come up with this new joint confession. And for Dumoulin at this point, again, this is 1613, in order to unite them, he wants to avoid any matters beyond those necessary to salvation, as he saw it. This would include Jacob Arminius' teaching on predestination and the perseverance of the saints. So Arminius dies in 1609. His teaching is beginning to be promulgated throughout the Reformed churches, obviously, especially in Holland, the Netherlands. So 1613, Dumoulin says, look, let's not take up the issue of Arminianism, because that will divide us. It's already dividing the Netherlands churches. Let's set that aside for the sake of this common confession. Now, he would change his tune about 5 years later with the Synod of Dort. But at least in 1613, he's saying we need to create room for those following Arminius. And he thought that this was possible, coming up with a new confession, because the Reformed churches already agreed on the essentials of the faith. He thought the only differences were related to polity and ceremony. And so he said that to prevent discord in these areas, each delegate would declare that his church would not condemn the other churches over these differences. So, for example, the Church of England is Episcopal in this era. The French Reformed Church, as I mentioned, was Presbyterian. So for the sake of unity, they would not throw barbs at each other and just kind of overlook these differences in polity, which Dumoulin thought were tertiary matters. And following the conclusion, if they were having this conference, they come up with this new confession, all the delegates then travel to England and they pay their respects to James. So James is kind of the Constantine figure of this plan for union. They all come and, kiss the ring afterwards. Thank you for enabling this to happen, O King James. And in the final point of his proposal, Dumoulin expressed the goal of unified Protestants holding an ecumenical council in order to reconcile with Rome. So first they have the Reformed come together, write a new confession, then the Reformed unite with Lutherans and have kind of a secondary level Protestant union, and then they invite Rome and they try to find some common ground together with Rome. One historian described this hope for reconciliation as breathtaking in its boldness and its apparent disregard of a century of bitterness and conflict that had followed Luther's 95 Theses of 1517. So really it was a pipe dream that they could bring together Rome and Protestants. But again, thinking about Dumoulin's life, all that he went through, the persecution, St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, his father running for his life on many occasions as a pastor, it's not inconceivable that he would seek this form of Christian unity in order to achieve peace. France had been ravaged by civil war for 50 years at this point. So if there's any hope at peace amongst the broader Christian world, he thought it was a worthwhile endeavor. And again, King James would kind of be the overseer of this plan, the Constantine figure, the one who would unite Christendom. And King James liked that. King James was he thought highly of himself, to put it mildly. So this is his plan for union, 1613. He submits it to the Synod, the French Reformed Synod, in 1614. And then in 1615, James invites Dumoulin to come to England. And he has to give a promise to the church in Paris that he will return, because they were afraid that Dumoulin would be wooed by King James to stay in England. So he arrives there in March of 1615. He receives a warm welcome by the king, and King James allows him the place of prominence. He allows Dumoulin to stand behind the royal chair at dinner. So this is a high honor. To me, it sounds like not much of an honor. I got to stand behind you and watch you eat. That's not really a nice thing to do. But that was, in that day, that was a very high honor, to stand behind the royal chair. So Dumoulin gets this, and that's a sign that James was very welcoming to him. And he does have multiple occasions for extended conversation with James. And Dumoulin works on behalf of James. He writes an apologetical treatise against Cardinal Duperron during his time in England. James brings Dumoulin to Cambridge, and he receives the Doctor of Divinity degree there, along with John Donne, the great poet. So that tells you the importance of Pierre Dumoulin in this era, that he's alongside John Donne receiving this Doctor of Divinity, and it was by the king's express mandate. At Cambridge, then he's granted a prebend at Canterbury, which basically is a kind of a stipend, an annual allowance given to him. So he's made a prebend at Canterbury, another very significant honor. And in Canterbury, he takes the oath of allegiance, again, swearing his loyalty to the English monarch. But he says, "As far as it doth not prejudice the allegiance due to my king." So even though he's in England, far away from the French king, he knows he better cover his bases, lest the French king get word that Dumoulin was trying to be treasonous in England. He traveled to Edinburgh, preached before the French exiles in Edinburgh there. The Scots were very welcoming to the French refugees during the wars of religion. And Pierre's father, Joachim, actually fled there during the 1580s when King James was still king in Scotland. And they were very welcoming to the French. And eventually, though, Dumoulin does return to Paris after his time in England. The plan for union dies. It probably never did have a chance, really, but it especially was curtailed by the Arminian controversy, which really ramps up in the 16 teens and comes to a head at the Synod of Dort in 1618 and 1619. So now I'll talk a bit about Dumoulin's time involved in the Arminian controversy. He published a book called The Anatomy of Arminianism. You can find, if you're interested, you can find much of Pierre Dumoulin's works in English on Google Books, including this Anatomy of Arminianism. Be warned, they're very lengthy. So you're looking, 300, 400, 500 pages for many of these. Not light reading, but they are in English, which is nice. He wrote The Anatomy of Arminianism after the close of the Synod of Dort. It was produced in 1619, but he actually wrote it prior to the beginning of the Synod. And this is his takedown of the position of the Arminians. But he was drawn into the controversy years earlier in 1612 that he was writing on behalf of King James. And in these works, he argued that the doctrines of the Arminians did not conform to Scripture, reason, or church tradition. And he used sola scriptura to defend the Reformed position and to attack his opponents. And he viewed the church fathers not as vindication par excellence of the Reformed confession, but as reliable secondary authorities in support of the Reformed interpretation of Scripture. So I'll skip his first writing against the Arminians, and we'll look just at the anatomy of Arminianism in the time we have left. As I said, he called for this joint confession, which would avoid issues that he thought were not necessary to salvation, as he said, including the subtle opinions proposed by Arminius on free will, the perseverance of the saints, and predestination. But then later, he wrote that his plan for union, he removed this element of creating space for the Arminian position, and he argued that we should exclude the Arminians from this plan of union. Now, in the Anatomy of Arminianism, as I mentioned, he completed it prior to the Synod of Dort, and he wanted to take it to the Synod of Dort, and the French were actually had a delegation that was appointed to attend the Synod, but they were barred from attending by the French king. So if you look, there's a famous painting of the Synod of Dort, and there's an empty space. You have all the delegates in their nations' places around the room. There's an empty space where the French Reformed would have sat. So the Synod kind of honored them in absentia, and Dumoulin was going to be one of the delegates to the Synod. But instead, he wrote this Anatomy of Arminianism and then published it after the Synod, and his primary weapon was sola scriptura. Similar to his approach against Roman Catholics, he defended the Reformed position with brief quotations and expositions of Scripture. Rarely did he offer detailed exegesis, though. So if you read the Anatomy of Arminianism, you'll see brief quotations of Scripture, but he doesn't go into a detailed exegesis. And he also used Scripture on the offensive against the Arminian position, explaining the passage and demonstrating his opponent's errors in light of these passages. He says, "It is necessary that all doctrine in the matter of salvation, which does not rest on the testimony of Scripture, shall fall." When he addressed the Arminian position on the free will of the unregenerate man, he declared, "If they stand here in judgment of Holy Scripture, there will be no place for doubting." So he says, if we examine them according to Scripture, there's no way the Arminians can stand. Their doctrine does not hold up to Scripture. So he starts with Scripture, sola scriptura, but then as a secondary weapon, he uses reason. And he says, Holy Scripture is supported by reason. And remember, he's a former philosophy professor. He wrote a textbook on logic. So he demonstrates the logical inconsistency of the Arminian position. He said, they so implicate themselves that they appear either to desire not to be understood or they distrust with their own cause. They're confused in their presentation of their beliefs. For example, Arminius said that election is of those that believe. Dumoulin said, but the dead ceased to believe. Therefore, Arminius ought to say, that he might be consistent to himself, that election is of those that cease to believe, and not of those that truly believe. He said that Arminians' unreasonable interpretation of Scripture forced them to rely solely upon human reason. Driven by Holy Scripture, they fly to reasoning. Just as they use Scripture without reason, so they urge reasons without Scripture. So they abandon Scripture, and they also abandon sound reasoning. In other places, he said, they employed Scripture against reason. In the first, there is rashness. In the second, there is obstinacy. Error in the one and error in the other. So again, they are condemned by Scripture and by reason. They're faithful to neither. He sought that his treatment of Arminian universal sufficient grace displays his critique of their exegesis and reason. In Deuteronomy 29, verse 4, the Lord has not given you a heart to understand, or eyes to see, or ears to hear. He said this drove one of the Arminians to fits as he tried to explain the obvious contradiction within the Arminian system. He said, with his ridiculous acumen, This Arminian claimed that God was willing to give the Israelites a heart to understand and eyes to see and ears to hear, but he was hindered by the Israelites themselves. Therefore, Dumoulin said they were able to obey God before he had given them a heart. But to obey, that is itself to have a heart. Therefore, they were able to have a heart before they had a heart. Therefore, they were able to have a heart before they had a heart. So he's showing their logical inconsistency. He goes on, they should say, God has not given them a heart because they were without a heart, as if the physician would not heal a blind man because the blind man would not see the physician coming. So the intellectual inconsistency of the Arminians. And he said they served as their own worst enemy because of this inconsistency. They condemned irresistible grace, which they called, in his words, a monster whose beard they pluck and whom they prick with needles and sticks. Irresistible grace. But he said they actually uphold a form of irresistibility. Arminians maintain that the Spirit can bring conversion by extraordinary means, including means that cannot be resisted. He said, here we have them confessing themselves guilty. For by this saying, whatever they have built up, they overthrow from the foundation. For if God converts certain men irresistibly and gives them faith by his precise and absolute will, it is impossible that these should be elected for foreseen faith, and by election which rests on the foreseeing of faith. For he who is absolutely and irresistibly appointed to faith must be absolutely appointed to salvation. So again, he uses reason and a reasonable interpretation of Scripture against these Arminian opponents. Much more to say about his writing against Arminians, but let's conclude here with some lessons we can take from Pierre Dumoulin. First, I think his courage. He was courageous as a pastor, as a churchman, as a polemicist, risking his life daily as a French Reformed pastor in just outside of Paris. Obviously, he had a major target on his back, and it's only by providence that he survived. So I think it's good for us today to see these Reformed forefathers as examples of courage that we would have. You know, in this country, most of us are not under physical threat, but we are under other forms of threat, being canceled, being ostracized in polite culture for our convictions. But I think we should have courage to stand for the truth, as these French Reformed pastors did under much more serious threats than we face in this country, and as our brothers and sisters around the world face today. Every Lord's Day I pray for the persecuted church, and so many of our brothers and sisters are persecuted today, and yet they are still so courageous to stand for the truth. It's should be emboldening, I think, for us. And then also his productivity. As I said, Dumoulin produced more than any other Reformed Protestant of that era, with the exceptions of Calvin and Beza. So his productivity is inspiring. He was very amazing in his production. If you do seek to read some of his stuff, just be warned, it's not all great. You know, he's not as, in my opinion, as he's not the level of theologian that John Owen was, or even Francis Turretin, some of these other guys from the 17th century. But it is worth reading, and it is good. But also be warned, you know, if you've read any Puritans, you know that sometimes they'll go around the tree over and over again. Like, didn't you just say this 5 pages ago? So be warned, you might do laps in some of his argumentation, just in case you missed it the first 5 times I said this. But it is good. And again, I think his Anatomy of Arminianism is a great takedown of Arminianism, if you can plod through some of the layers of it. And then also, I think we can learn from his political entanglements. As I said, his relationship with James backfired. And when he entered into that political realm in a very obvious way, petitioning James to become involved in the 30 Years' War, it nearly cost him his life. It cost him his church. He was exiled from France and was really a great tragedy in his life. So had he avoided those political entanglements, he could have been more effective in the French Reformed Church and remained in Paris for almost 40 years after that time. So I think it's a lesson for us to avoid these snares of certain political entanglements that would jeopardize our witness to the gospel. We never want politics to get in the way of the proclamation of the gospel. And this is why I have taken the advice of some elders in the faith, and I don't disclose my personal political convictions. Nobody knows how I vote. My elders don't know how I vote. I don't disclose that because I don't want something so trivial as politics in the civil kingdom to be a barrier to the proclamation of the gospel. Because if someone has different political convictions than I do, if I had disclosed them, well, that person might not be able to hear the proclamation of the gospel from me then. If he's thinking, well, I can't listen to this guy. He votes differently than I do. So therefore, he must be wrong about his preaching. So I'm not involved in those things. To me, the proclamation of the gospel is priority. So I think we could do well from learning from Dumoulin in his failure. In that case, not to let those things become a barrier to the most important thing, the proclamation of the gospel.